Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
There's public and bipartisan political pressure mounting over rising drug prices. This includes from the Trump administration, along with numerous Democratic presidential candidates. With all of this going on, there's a concept that's relatively new to the United States, although it's been around since the 60s, and it's known as QALY, spelled QALY, and stands for Quality Adjusted Life Year. It puts a dollar figure on a year of healthy life, calculates how much health a drug restores to a sick patient, and then prices the drug accordingly. This is per the Wall Street Journal, an article entitled Obscure Model Puts Price on Healthy Year of Life. So why do you care about this seemingly not all that new, but new to the U.S. method of determining what the cost of a drug should be? Well, as highlighted before, there's a lot of public and political pressure on rising drug prices, and about 46% of the U.S. population used one or more prescription drugs in the past 30 days, according to the National Center for Health Statistics. So you could be one of the people using one of these prescription drugs, or you probably know somebody that's using one of these. So there's a lot to talk about here and to take a look at what exactly this method entails, and is it something that we as Americans want to start using? It has had some success at lowering drug prices. The question is, even though at face value that seems like a good thing, what exactly is a year of healthy life worth? And we can't begin any critical conversation without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
And while on the surface, it sounds good, as we read the article, there are some concerns about how it would work with government health care. So, should be an interesting discussion today. It is a very interesting topic. I am one of those two people in the United States who has to use prescription drugs on a daily basis. So I am very interested in this topic on a personal level.
So the Wall Street Journal article, again, if you want to follow along, there is a lot of information. So if it's helpful for you to be able to look at that, you can go to thestateofus.org and follow along there. So let's talk about what is QALY. As we noted earlier in the show, it's actually really not all that new of a concept. In fact, in the late 60s, a team in Canada and Britain started developing ways to compare the cost effectiveness of different healthcare options. This team decided to use a 3-point scale, with 1 point signifying no health problem and 3 representing a severe debilitation. They applied that across 5 core components of quality of life: pain, mobility, ability to care for oneself, ability to carry out daily tasks, and mental health. So you have all these different indicators, and you have a certain number of points that you can get. Now, the modern system is a little bit more advanced than that, or at least the one that's being used here in the U.S. that is known as QALY. And again, it comes into the picture here. It works like this: 1 year spent in perfect health equals 1 QALY. A year with some kind of health problem that affects quality of life would be worth less than 1 QALY. How much less depends on the severity of the problem. So take a 55-year-old whose life expectancy might be another 24 years of life. If that person is in perfect health, those 24 years would mean 24 QALYs. For someone who's suffering from untreated rheumatoid arthritis, though, those 24 years could be marked by extreme pain, loss of mobility, and translate to just 10 QALYs instead of the 24. If a drug price reduces the pain and improves mobility, it might add back another 5 QALYs for a total of 15 QALYs. So we started at, we've got somebody who's in perfect health would get 24 QALYs. Somebody with rheumatoid arthritis may only get 10. But if they start taking this drug, now they'd get up to 15 QALYs. ICER, which is the nonprofit that provides the QALY analysis, works out the benefit by reviewing the data on the drug and translating the outcomes into QALYs. So ICER has affixed a maximum value of $150,000 for each QALY a drug can add. basically, Lance, saying that the worth, right, on average of one person's single year of good quality life can be worth a maximum of $150,000.
And that's based on the value that Americans put on good health and are willing to pay or can pay for their health care. I think it's very interesting to point out here that the group that has come up with this concept are a group of economists. So
Yes.
they're very cut and dry. These aren't doctors. These aren't people in the medical field. These are just economists who put numbers and values to things, and really without any kind of, well, how's this going to play out with the reality of people's lives? I mean, if you've ever talked to an economist, they really don't talk about the, the human side of things.
Right.
Everything is
They just want
based,
the numbers.
It's based on the numbers. Right.
And ICER stands for, by the way, I should have mentioned that, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And that's an outgrowth of Harvard Medical School. It has no political affiliation or official policy-making role, but it latched on to the British-Canadian concept and basically created our version of QALY. Now, one of the areas that you have to look at in determining, what's the value of this, and we're going to talk about some of the downsides in a minute, because I think, at first glance, Lance, excuse me there for the rhyme, I started reading this and I thought, well, this sounds like it makes some kind of sense. I mean, we could debate, right, how much a year of life is worth or whatever, but they tried to put in some research into figuring this out. So you set that aside for a minute and just assume that we can agree on what that's worth. Using this kind of scale would seem to make sense in determining the cost of a drug. And in fact, it has had some success at changing prices. The makers, according to the article, the makers of the cholesterol-lowering drug Prolent, I don't know how you say these drug names, but which first went on sale for $14,600, offered to sell it for as little as $4,500 after rebates. And a new migraine drug expected to cost up to $10,000 a year. It went on sale for $6,900 instead. And a life-saving gene therapy for children that its maker said might cost up to $5 million was priced at $2.1 million.
Using this system.
Well, the drug makers didn't use the system. The institute used the system and basically used it to shame the drug makers into saying, no, what you're saying this is worth is not really the case. Right.
And so, again, it's a way to get to start to address that question that is a national question, and that is the cost of prescription drugs to the healthcare industry. And so it at least is a starting point. This is what I look at it, because there are some good things here, and it has worked in other places, and we just need to see how it would work here in the United States and discuss that and adapt it accordingly is probably the need for us here.
Well, and especially there's so many, I think there's not a lot of issues all the time that we can talk about and say there's broad agreement on, but I think there's broad agreement that everybody would like for drug prices to be lower, probably. We know that Americans pay.
Well, everybody but the drug companies.
Right.
And the people who, make money off of them with the stock, holding the stocks of those companies.
Well, and the irony here, I don't know if you kind of think about it, but basically the argument that QALY is making is they're saying to the drug maker, a year of healthy life isn't worth in other words, they're saying a year of healthy life is worth less than what you're suggesting it is.
Right.
And that's how they're, coming up with these lower drug prices. And basically, so it's kind of funny because something that would save us money is basically using the argument that a good year for Lance isn't worth as much as these drug companies who are trying to say, well, Lance is worth, at least $500,000 a year.
Right.
Right. I mean, that is basically what they're doing. But it's kind of a different justification and a different way of looking at it.
Well, I think another good point to make here is the reason that drug companies are at least discussing some formula to come up with drug prices is because of the public and bipartisan political pressure that they're receiving. Hey, it works.
It does.
And everybody, bangs on the system all the time, but here we go. The American people want something, and the Democrats and Republicans decide to get on board and put pressure on the drug companies. And all of a sudden the drug companies are going, well, we're willing to sit down and talk now.
Right.
So it's not just the people that are upset, and it's not just the Democrats that are upset, and it's not just the Republicans that are upset, but it's all three. And when all three of us get on the same page, we maybe can accomplish something good for everyone involved. Isn't that a novel idea?
Well, and we talked about this. I mean, we talk about healthcare quite a bit because it is something that affects so many of us. At one point in our lives, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to set foot, in some kind of healthcare facility for something that you need done, whether that's just an annual type of checkup thing or whether that's for something more serious. Most Americans are going to encounter the healthcare system. And in turn there, as we know, since about 1 out of every 2 Americans is using a prescription drug on some kind of regular basis, drug costs affect all of us or affect somebody close to us. My father is on one of those drugs that for a long time has had such a high cost that it was when he went into Medicare, it was a nightmare trying to figure out, okay, which Medicare option do I need? And then which supplemental plan do I need that will cover this? And even finding a supplemental plan that would technically cover it, because again, and that's what we'll talk about here in a second, in the US, things are a little wonky. In some ways, patients actually have more rights than in other places. And then in some ways, the fact that we have more rights in turn leads to higher costs. So that's one of those trade-offs that we don't always realize and talk about. So it'll be interesting to look into this, and we'll share with you some more about the downsides of QALY. And then in the last bit of the show, Lance and I will make our determination on, is this something we want to get behind? Is this mostly good, mostly bad? Is it a step in the right direction? Where are we at? So again, if you want to follow along, thestateofus.org, thestateofus.org. Plenty more to come. Keep it right here, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
So with mounting drug prices and bipartisan political pressure, along with public pressure, drug companies are starting to pay attention. And ICER, also known as the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, which is an outgrowth of Harvard Medical School, is using a new system called QALY. And although the system itself isn't new, their adaptation is relatively recent, as of 2013. They have had some success at getting drug companies to lower their drug prices. We highlighted some of those in the first bit of the show. And now we're going to talk about some of the things that may not be as obvious, but are certainly potential downsides of using this type of model. One interesting thing, although not surprising, is that many drug makers say QALYs are too blunt of a tool for measuring the value of a drug and don't take into account a new medicine's novelty or its effect on the lives of caregivers, not just patients. Critics also say the values used in QALY calculations are arbitrary and unscientific. So there's 2 things here, Lance, 3 things, really. Let's break them down. Set aside for a minute that these come from drug makers, okay? Because I actually think part of what they bring up is a valid point. We may say it's not, we may not agree with it, but I think it's valid. The first thing that they're highlighting here is that it doesn't take into account a new medicine's novelty. Now, the way that I see this, and you tell me if you disagree, but the way that I think the argument's being made here is if there's no other drug in the world, right, that can do this, then this drug, there's value assigned to it beyond just what it'll do for somebody. In other words, they're arguing, we've put in all this time, this is revolutionary, and there should be some kind of monetary reward or some part of the drug's price that is attributed to its novelty.
No, I mean, that's true. But again,
but is that why we make drugs?
Well, and then you counter and it's like, okay, what's going to be the public perception if you're a drug company and you've come out with this new drug that will do all of these things? And then you have to stand behind your idea that, well, but you guys can't take it because you're not willing to pay for it. We're not going to make it affordable. I mean, what's going to be the public outcry when that happens? I mean, I would not want to be that pharmaceutical company that says, I have this miracle drug, but I'm going to price it so high that nobody's going to be able to afford it or no insurance company is going to accept it to pay for it. So you're all going to have to do without. I understand their argument as the pharmaceutical company that, hey, you got to give us some credit for the value of this. But if you're not going to price it so that it's available and so that insurance companies will cover it, does it really do you any good? And do you want to be known as that Scrooge who has this wonder drug who won't let anybody take it because you're going to price it so high for whatever reason? I mean, I understand.
Right.
I understand it's a valid argument from the pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah.
But the PR disaster that you could be setting up for your company, which is probably producing other drugs as well, that then would cause people to look for something else to take. Because I know with some of the drugs I take, there are 5 or 6 options.
Right.
Because
the one you're taking isn't the only choice.
Right. Because my doctor has said, well, we'll try this one. And if it doesn't work, we'll do this. Or my insurance company says, we won't pay for this one, but we'll pay for that one. And so then I'm in that negotiation with my doctor and my insurance company is just saying, okay, doc, is one of these that they'll pay for going to do the same thing? Or do you want me to have this one? Now, see, as a patient, that really, excuse my language here, pisses me off. If my doctor, who I trust, says this is what's best for me to take, then I want my insurance company to pay for that. I understand that it doesn't, and it doesn't have to, but that's one of those things that I think we have to figure out here sooner rather than later here in the United States.
Well, and here's the kicker, okay? Most of us probably don't always remember this, but the article points out, it says the following. In the U.S., insurers don't have the option that makes cost per QALY analyses so effective in curbing drug prices in other countries. That's the ability to walk away. They are prohibited from refusing to pay for treatments solely on the grounds of cost. Now, again, one of the big
all that means is I can make up another reason.
Right.
Even though cost is the driving reason for my decision, I can come up with another one.
Yes. But I think part of what the article is getting at here is that's actually not a good thing because they can't walk away for that reason, they manufacture other reasons that, again, fit within the system. I mean, we're not saying that, they're necessarily breaking the rules. They're playing by the rules and they're saying, well, if we can't reject it on this, we ain't going to pay for it. So we're going to go, we're going to go find a different reason.
Right.
And in other countries, that's not the case. Most of them can walk away and say, no, we're not doing that.
But then they have to negotiate. And there's the example in the article about Great Britain, who spent 4 years with the drug company and before they found common ground so that the national healthcare system in Great Britain would pay for the drug. So that means for 4 years, people who needed it have gone without it.
So there's the flip side there too of, well, we can negotiate, but also since we were at a stalemate, it took 4 years and how many people suffered or died during that time because they couldn't afford it and we couldn't reach an agreement.
Right.
So a lot of times, and this is one of those things that frustrates me.
Here's the good and bad, right? I mean, we're into the good and bad of the system.
You look at all the Democratic presidential candidates, and not all of them, but are ones on the further left, okay? Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, right? Mm-hmm. Or the two most notable on the far, far left. They both often are very fond of socialized medicine. And I mean, that's for the most part, that's what they're pushing, right? They want to basically do away with private insurance.
And their supporters are very strongly point to the Canadian and the British and the European model that are discussed here in this article.
Correct. And while you will get health care, how soon you'll get it and what you'll get are mostly not up to you. And that is one of the downsides. Now, one of the proposals that's been put forward that I'm more in favor of is, and we looked at this in this show that we did probably like 2 months ago now or so, where we talked about we
compared the programs to a house.
Yes.
And how they were redoing the house or structuring the house and what the house would look like.
Yeah. And one of those was this idea that you've got billions annually that Medicare is negotiating, doesn't negotiate, but could be negotiating with in what it pays out to drug companies, right?
Along with the Veterans Administration.
Those
are two of the bigger government entities with
You've
healthcare.
Got the VA and Medicare who are not negotiating because by law, it's illegal for them to negotiate. This is one where, I try to see the other side of the argument. I guess the other side of this was what they didn't want is for what happened in Great Britain to happen, which is for Medicare, right, to basically say, we're not going to pay that. You have to give it to us for this. And then for the drug company to say, well, we ain't doing that.
But
right?
Private insurers can, right?
Well, and that's right. Private insurers not in the U.S. That's the same problem. They manufacture a different reason. That's what we just talked about there. They don't have the ability to walk away. They're prohibited from refusing to pay for treatment solely on the grounds of cost, but that's where they just find a different reason, well, this drug isn't proven to be, doesn't meet our standard of X for you as a patient because of your health in this area, whatever. And again, Lance and I are not experts on this. We're trying to analyze it from an outsider perspective. But I do think that's an important thing to highlight of the trade-off here, right? You could let Medicare negotiate, but then do we have to put a provision in place to prevent a stalemate for years, right? Because, I can tell you the drug that my father takes, if he didn't take it, he'd basically not be able to walk. Right. So, we got locked in a stalemate and we can't, we're not paying for it at all. And my dad can't afford it. So his option is to just not walk, right? While these two are sparring and trying to figure it out. And for other people, it's even worse than that, right? Death. Because we can't pay, I can't afford it. So I'm going to die now. So there is that other side of, you let the government negotiate, but then does that cause problems? And that's where this type of thing, QALY, comes into play with the idea of if you put in place a system that is always used to assess the price of a drug, then there is no negotiation because this is just the price. The flip side and the part that upsets people with QALY, the next thing that drug makers mentioned is it doesn't take into effect the benefit to caregivers. This one I thought was a pretty valid point, perhaps more so than the first one, because the way QALY works, right, is it says, well, what's the benefit to Lance?
To the patient,
right? What's the benefit to you specifically, the person taking the drug? Mm-hmm. But it doesn't take into account, well, what does this do for all the people that either depend on you or that you depend on?
Or giving you care.
Right.
It's all of a sudden your spouse or your children or, your nurse or whoever you're hiring, they now don't have to do as much work and their quality of life is better. Or you can do more things for yourself, so it frees them up to do other things. So there are other people who benefit from you being in good health or from me being in good health. Yeah. That's a really valid point, because if you've ever had to care for someone, I think we all have, when they're ill, when they're sick, it makes your life a whole lot more. If someone in your family has, the flu and you have to cook everything and wash everything and care for them and check on them every hour or whatever, it puts a real crimp in your lifestyle
and you could even get
days.
Sick.
Sure. And you can even
that
get
doesn't, sick. We don't even take that into account, right?
So to not count the caregivers is, I think, a valid argument when you look at, okay, if we're going to adopt something like this, what factors need to be included?
How do we somehow take into account the other, a year of good health for Lance isn't just about Lance. Right.
That's episode. That's the third segment here coming up, right? We're going to have to discuss this and come up with what we think is going to work best. We've got all these different programs out there from different countries and what ICER is saying. And so now what do we think is the best one to put into place for the United States?
And we're having this conversation today, Lance, right? Because the State of Us is part of a larger network of programs at TrueChat, and TrueChat's got a central mission that all these podcasts are pursuing.
Yes, and that mission here at TrueChat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations.
So we've got more to come. We've got to talk about, is QALY, in other words, are Lance and I just happy with the way it is? Or do we just believe it's the very best that we can do right now, step in the right direction? Or maybe there's a couple modifications we could make that would make it even better. Maybe we know better than those Harvard economists, Lance. What do you think? We'll find out, right?
I doubt it, but we'll try.
People got to stick around. So keep it right here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Rising drug prices and mounting public pressure and political pressure, bipartisan, mind you, have all led to this, an episode on The State of Us where we're talking about a system that, albeit isn't truly new, started in the late 60s, is relatively new to the United States. It's known as QALY, QALY, and it stands for Quality Adjusted Life Year. In other words, what is a good year of life truly worth? They use this scale to determine a point value and assign it, and then ultimately make a determination on how much a drug should cost. They have had some success at essentially shaming drug companies into lowering their price for new drugs. This was developed off of the 1960s model by the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, which is an outgrowth of Harvard Medical School. Again, we're referencing an article in the Wall Street Journal entitled Obscure Model Puts Price on Healthy Year of Life. So you can check this out at thestateofus.org. Lance, we've talked a lot about some of the downsides of this, and in the first bit of the show, some of the upsides, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the biggest and most clear upside is they've gotten drug companies to lower prices on some things, right?
Right.
I mean, that's pretty simple.
They have been able to, just through almost, what would you say? It's not really peer pressure, but public pressure.
Right.
By saying, hey, here's our model that we came up with as economists, and here's really what it should cost. And then getting that information out there, and then people saying, hey, yeah, why are you charging this?
Right.
Do you really want to go public and say, this is what it's going to cost, when we've got this, mathematical equation we've set up that shows it should only be worth this? But I would like to point out just very quickly, since you did talk about this system, that ICER, the group in the United States that has done this, is taking the quality of life third highest out of the countries that use a QALY system. Behind Belgium and Norway. Belgium and Norway value a life a little bit more than ICER did, but we are about 30% higher than what Canada and the Netherlands and Japan have done. So, again, because you talk about the quality of life,
we're Americans, right?
Right, but the quality of life determines the cost of the drug.
Yes.
So,
I mean, that's what the system's based on.
Yeah.
So
I mean, that's a key point there as to the dollar amount you give to the quality of life, because then that in turn determines the cost of the drug. That is a fair option according to the economist who came up with the system. I'm not trying to talk around the issue, but that's a big part of the equation.
Now tell me how we get around this, because I've been thinking, okay, we've talked through all this. We've talked about some of the concerns that drug companies have brought up, right? For example, that the quality of life of caregivers,
that's a huge one to me,
is not taken into account. Now, in defense of QALY, I would say that's going to be really hard to ever get a very accurate number on for a lot of reasons. I mean, one.
Yeah, but isn't the number that they pick for the value of a quality year of life?
That's the next thing I'm getting to.
That's just a number we're pulling out of the air. I mean, I'm sure that they have some knowing economists like I do, and I know 2 or 3 really well that I call friends. They have a valid reason for choosing that number. It's not just one they pulled out of the air. But when you look at the top 15 countries, it ranges from a few $1,000s to almost $200,000 per country, as to what number they pick to value a life. So but the caregiver one is huge because, and I want to throw this in before I forget it, because at my age, until they come up with a drug, I do that occasionally. The whole caregiver thing. But what if the drug allows me to continue to live by myself and take care of myself
versus going into the system,
rather going into the caregiving system or a nursing home or bringing someone in, a private nurse to check on me?
I think that would be huge drugs too.
When
from
you talk
cost
about
standpoint,
right? Exactly. That's where the caregiver thing comes into me. It's not just for that individual that's caring for you, but okay, it's going to cost how much money for the system to put me in an assisted living facility and pay for that, versus the fact that I can stay in my own home and continue to care for myself because the drug that I'm taking allows me to do that. Well, so that's why I think that caregiver, air quote, category is so huge.
And staying in your own home, right? There's more benefits than just you haven't entered the system. There's also the benefits of you keep paying an electric bill, you keep paying property tax. I mean, and you may even, right, be buying more things than if you were in a facility. You're going to keep shopping at stores. You're not going through the assisted living facility where they're going to provide meals. And I know all this varies.
Well, but at least
stuff,
to me, mentally, right now where I am, my quality of life is a whole lot higher if I'm on my own making those own decisions rather than being in an assisted living thing. So, I mean, if you're
there's like four different things that come into play in regards to whether or not it puts you in the system. There's the cost to the system,
right?
The cost, the quality of your life versus if you're in the system or not, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's higher when you're not. And then there's the cost of what you contribute to the economy by not going into the healthcare system.
So that whole caregiver category, to me, is expanded.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not as
there's a bunch of different.
There's more things that I would put. I mean, either that or you break it down into individual categories. But for our purpose, I would put them all in that caregiver, and not to count that, not to put that into the value. I think they're kind of missing the boat.
So the biggest,
my opinion.
Yeah. That's a big objection of mine in terms of, you know, if we were going to go so far as to say we want the government to somehow officially recognize this or whatever, you know, any step like that where we get into, cause at the moment, no one's to say that they're not allowed to do this. I mean, they're academics and economists, and they're doing this as part of the center and the nonprofit that they're working for.
And nobody's legally held to this,
right?
In the United States,
nobody's required to do
an idea that's out there. We haven't made it part of the legal system.
It's just like if Lance and I came up with this and just started, you know, on our show, we just started doing this, and we were shaming. I mean, anybody can do that. We have that right, you know, so there's nothing, we're not saying by any means that this is illegal or they should stop doing it. What we are saying is if we look at, do we want to expand something like this, make it a more formal type of thing? The biggest objection I have into, and you highlighted this, is the caregiver thing's huge, but it's not my main one. My main one is how much is a life worth? You know, a year of healthy life.
You're always into that. Okay.
Well, but the reason, think about it. Okay.
And you value all life equally.
So, we're not going to open that can of worms. All right. but here's my problem with that one. Okay. If, just hypothetically, say the U.S. government does some kind of action to recognize this. Okay.
In some form or fashion. Okay.
Whether that's like fully adopting it and, you know, creating a section of the government that does this process now, or whether it's just to say that this is a, you know, good way, like a resolution just stating, you know, this is a valid way to determine whatever. If they do anything like that, where they take some kind of formal action that recognizes this, you have opened a massive legal precedent, because now outside of healthcare, okay, so set healthcare aside, there's going to be all these people that point to and say, this is how much a life is worth. And now when I go to sue somebody, or when I am getting sued, whole new can of worms, whole mess now of, well, your life is only worth this much per year. So this thing happened to you, and that means that it, you know, what we pay you is only worth this. You know what I mean? It just,
is that necessarily a bad thing, though? Well, when we look at all those litigations out there for, well, this person was killed at this age by this, so therefore life expectancy is this. So now they're awarded a $4 trillion settlement by the insurance.
Well, and that might be, right.
So, I mean, is it necessarily a bad idea to do that? I mean, you're bringing it up as a concern, and I'm just countering with, and I see your point. I see your point. But is that necessarily a bad idea?
Well, like your example, I think that would be an instance where it's probably a good thing, because we do have these what seem to be totally wild, crazy settlements that we hear about. Like, you know, the one that always comes to mind for me is the lady that burnt her tongue on, you know, hot coffee from McDonald's and won, you know, and got whatever millions.
I think it was her lap.
Right.
She spilled it in her lap. It wasn't her tongue.
She tasted it and it was hot, and then
she jumped,
jerked and
it went down
and scalded her.
Scalded her body.
Yes. So, but that comes to mind for me a lot when you think about what seems to be, not that she didn't have pain and suffering, but that was the pain and suffering really
outlandish litigation.
Right. For somebody who's never made that kind of money in their life anyway, is that, I don't know. So outlandish litigation is a big one. But to me, you flip it around and you say, well, if we've priced, for example, 150,000, right, is the max value of a human life per year in good condition. Now we can extrapolate from that what a human life is worth on the total. Right? Mm-hmm. Because we can say life expectancy is 74, multiply by 150,000. This is how much a human life is worth, right? We've nailed it down. This is the definitive governmental number of what it's worth. So now, Lance, I go out and I kill a senior, right? Who's 4 years away from life expectancy end, right? Mm-hmm. So I make the argument to the court, which would seem to be totally valid, that their life was worth this much money. Rather than go to jail, I have the money and I will pay to the family exactly what that person was worth. Because the government has said this is what someone's worth, and therefore I am happy, to pay exactly what it's worth.
It's not that we haven't done that before, because during the Civil War, both the United States and the Confederate States of America allowed for people to buy a replacement soldier rather than be drafted. So it's not like the United States hasn't done this there in the past. Mm-hmm. So while that might start to freak out some people, about a futuristic concept, it's one that we've broached before in our history.
Yeah. Well, if you had enough money, you could avoid things.
Well, and don't you still do that?
Sure.
And we only have 25 seconds left in the show, but don't you do that if you can afford a better lawyer?
Oh, yeah.
You get better...
Or better health care.
Right.
Yeah.
You get better representation.
No, absolutely.
So we do that already. So is that really fundamentally any different than we already have? I'm throwing that out there as a rhetorical question because we don't have time really to get into it. But you do bring up a good point, but then aren't we doing that already?
Yeah.
We're just not putting it down on paper.
I think
we all know it intellectually, but we're not putting it down in real numbers.
Exactly. Well, and that's, I'm on the same page there with you. I think in many ways, we already essentially do what this is doing. The key is, and that's, I pulled it again, as I do, way up to this big hypothetical picture, because I think part of what happens in our political system is often we are too short-sighted. We see something that's good or we see something that's bad and we say, well, if we just do this, it'll be fine. And we've had some terrible, awful things that we've done in this country as a result of snap decisions like that, as a result of public pressure.
Well, and you make a good point, though, as well. You made it earlier in the show, and that is when we do something new, people have to be a little bit patient because we have to work through it. We saw it with government healthcare with what everybody calls Obamacare. Okay. There were some problems there, but the idea was good, I think. I believe that the idea was good.
On the whole.
So let's work through the problems and get rid of it. We always want to come up now, it seems like, well, let's come up with the solution. And so then we freeze and do nothing because it has some problems. Well, going back to Reagan, okay, if I can get if it's 60% positive, well, right now we're doing nothing. 60% positive is better than 0% positive. So then, okay, then let's enact it and then let's work on making it better once we find the snafus. And I know people were probably like, how can you do that? If it's not perfect, how can you put it in place? Well, if it's beneficial, if it's more beneficial than what we're currently doing, then let's go with it. And then let's continue to work out the bugs, because to sit here and do nothing means it's not getting any better at all.
Right.
And I would rather have it be incrementally better, knowing that we're working towards 100% solution or a 90% solution, than sitting here saying, well, you know what? The system, we all agree that the system needs to be improved, but we're not going to do anything about it because we can't agree on what really needs to be done.
Yeah. Which is a bad.
That I just can't, I can't argue in favor of doing that.
No. And that's why I think I would say, on the whole, I would be interested in our lawmakers, our representatives, putting something together to either, help fund further research into this QALY-based method, or perhaps even to adopt some kind of limited test program that clearly defines that you can't expand this into other arguments. In other words, we are limiting the scope of this legal definition of how much a human life is worth to only drug prices. In other words, we're putting in place some kind of law that would prohibit arguments in court being brought forward in other areas. Because to me, that's the one big, and I'm not even a lawyer. I'm sure there's probably lawyers listening to this thinking, oh my gosh, we're going to have all this. I think if you put that in place and you do some kind of trial run, limit it to a certain number of drugs and see, because right now you've got this nonprofit group on the fringes. So I would be in favor of looking at doing something like that, because as Lance said, him and I are both just so opposed to the whole, well, none of us can agree on, we can't figure out the best thing, so therefore we're just doing nothing, and it's like, no, as somebody who has family and friends and myself have taken prescription drugs, we got to do something, and we can't wait 50 years to figure out the quote unquote perfect solution. And there's probably not a perfect solution anyway. So let's do something. Let us know your thoughts. thestateofus.org. All links to social media are there, along with the articles from today's show, the information and resources. So please check it out. Lance, we've challenged people to tune in, right? Get their friends, family, etc., to start listening to The State of Us to further the conversation. So if you're going to go out and invite somebody to tune in, what are the ways you could tell them they can listen?
Well, you can find us on Stitcher, my personal favorite, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
For The State of Us on TrueChat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change.